talk to the futurists and the techno-enthusiasts, I mean, people like Kurzweil and Kevin Warwick and so on the one hand, and Aubrey de Grey, and the people who are more skeptical, perhaps those involved more in the corporate world, who are seeing these things in more sober terms. But even if you take a sort of midpoint, or sort of go a quarter of the way, it seems to me the impact of these technologies in convergence is going to be far greater than the public mind, and particularly the public mind as focused in the mind of policymakers, has grasped. And the opportunity to provide the kind of assessment, critique, reflective faculty which has essentially been the bioethics enterprise, I think is very great, but needs to be more self-conscious and I think more focused if it's going to achieve what I think all of us would like it to achieve, and we will agree and disagree about many of the particulars. But I think what unites us is our concern about the importance of the questions. And having said that, my own suggestions lie in somewhat different directions. I think bioethics has, if you like, a branding problem. I think it's an obscure word. I think it's a term that's never quite been accepted within the public domain. It's a word whose meaning, as we were saying yesterday, is not at all clear. I mean, you can define it's a pretty squishy term. And my sense is that ethics really has two kinds of significance in the public arena. One is, of course, ethics can refer to scandal. And an ethics issue raised, qua scandal, of course, dominates the media and can have dramatic policy impact. But that is not the sense in which, of course, bioethics understands itself and bioethics is used. Bioethics seems to be a kind of normative exercise. So, the governments say this issue has arisen, it's controversial, we'll refer it to these bioethicists, they will resolve the issue, as if there was some sort of normative activity going on here, which I think we probably all agree is a half-truth. But at the same time, if you raise an ethics issue in the policy arena, except in scandal mode, it is a way of personalizing it, of privatizing it. And I think one of the unfortunate uses of bioethics from the policymaker's point of view has been to get an issue off the hard policy agenda and into the private world. And so bioethics, of course, is a matter of personal opinion. You can have your opinion, I've got my opinion. These are questions which may or may not have policy implications, but I think they're weakened when they're framed and branded in bioethics terms. And I think this is pretty much what the last 30 years demonstrates. So I think there's a branding weakness, quite apart from the internal sort of problems of the exercise. And instead, or as well, and I think this is a matter of retooling, this is a term I used, for what comes ahead, I think we have to find ways into policy questions which are direct. And policy is the hard term. Ethics is the soft term. And secondly, we have to find ways into the corporate community, into the business world, particularly the world of finance, investment, reinsurance, the risk community. Partly because increasingly it seems to me policy, in fact, is going to be made by corporations and what they decide to do. In some ways, Google and Microsoft are now showing us, good and bad, what that means. Because enormous decisions have been taken about the lives of all of us by Google, by Facebook, and so on and so forth. As big areas of our lives are being impacted by corporate decisions of which we have very little leverage at all. And I think this is just the beginning. When you really have full-scale virtual reality, whether it's bodysuits or not, and it's all basically powered by skull caps or jacks in your brain. Because all this stuff is out there now at a basic level. I mean, this is not tomorrow's technology, this is today's technology taken forward. So you can live entirely in virtual reality. I mean, you begin thinking of that kind of context and of the fact, of course, that we're going to have an underclass of people and an overclass of people who don't have jobs for different reasons in the future, as well as perhaps more leisure for all of us, perhaps not, depending upon the scenarios. but a context in which people will live in virtual worlds for large periods of their lives, just as one little example, and in which what they do, how they do it, what this means for their external lives, and all the rest of it, will depend very largely upon corporate decisions and technologist decisions and decisions made privately, not decisions made through public process. And it seems to me, secondly, that the way to get to policymakers, the real policymakers, not the ones that have to send out to talk to ethicists to keep them happy, is, of course, through corporate decision-making and the participation of corporate leaders and those who are seen to be driving the economy, which, of course, is increasingly dependent on innovation, technological innovation, and will continue to be more and more. So that the decisions taken by risk assessment processes involving investment and reinsurance, as well as by decisions by corporate leaders themselves, are going to be at the center of the influences upon policymakers. So it seems to me, and I think that the good news to my mind of this sort of analysis is that there's a lot of win-win out there. Particularly as the timeline to development of many of these technologies is not short, certainly when it comes to developing particular products and outputs. At the same time, there is serious concern. Obviously, I mean, the GM food story is the classic example, but investors are savvy. They know that it's no good developing something which no one's going to buy, or which maybe will be highly successful, but at the same time highly successful in a very fragile context, or a context in which regulatory regimes may change, and so on and so forth. So that focusing on, if you like, the private decision-making taking place, I think is going to be yet more significant in itself and as a route of access to policymakers. So, to sum up, I do think that there's much to be learned by the sort of parallax, contrasting of European and American approaches. American focus on process, I think, is in a sense, makes many ethical debates quite difficult to have in the States, because they just all tend to boil down to process discussions about consent and so on. At the same time, I think that the confidence we have had in the semi-success of bioethics as an enterprise is somewhat misplaced. And the notion you can just roll forward bioethics into neuroethics or, fill-in-the-blank ethics as every technology comes along, I think is naive. I think the questions being raised in these discussions are of enormous import. And I think we need to have a much more self-conscious discussion about how we frame these conversations, how we label them, and whom we involve in them. As I was just saying to somebody a little earlier this morning, I mean, it is to my mind simply odd, even if it is completely normal, that we sit around the table for a couple of days here having these conversations, and there's nobody here from the corporate world. There's nobody here from a trade organization, for example, dealing with the technologies which are behind the whole bioethics discussion. There's also nobody here from the policy community itself. I mean, ultimately, it seems to me, if the academy is going to take the lead in fomenting the kind of leveraged cultural conversations that will then frame policy decisions, we have to find fresh ways of working, as well as fresh ways of talking about what we're doing. And I think there are many opportunities to do that, but I think it will involve some lateral thinking, and some thinking which does not come easily to those who are more pure academics than perhaps I am. Thank you very much.